Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS. This is Ukraine War news update for the 8th of August 2023, second part to this update. Please check out my first part out already. We'll go to a couple of sources that give a bit of an overview of the whole front line, so it's going to be a bit all over the place, this segment. This is a frontline segment. I will try and do a more in-depth frontline analysis later today if I have the chance. The armed forces, says Max 23, of Ukraine repulsed the Russians near Novohayarivka, but they do not control Novosiliska. So this is talking about the Kupiansk front line, Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna. There is a small village of Novosiliska to the west of Kuzumivka. That is a bit of a grey zone. This, I think, is the claim that the Ukrainians do not control Novosiliska, so that probably is a grey zone now. So the Russians have made some advances there, but the Russians have been pushed back from Novohayarivka in this Karmazianivka area, which is this bottom left-hand map. You can't really see those maps very clearly. We'll come on to look at some other maps in a second. And generally in the Kupiansk area, the Russian Federation has brought in fresh forces and a considerable number of assault units attacking through fields and forest strips, which is facilitated by 2-meter high grass. This is what happens when and the UK intelligence did an update on this the other day and got a bit of hassle for it because talking about vegetation. But vegetation is the areas have not been farmed, so there's a lot of vegetation that is allowing cover, meaning that it's more difficult to advance quickly than if they were just ploughed fields, for example. Of course, you know, it depends what your benchmark for comparing these kind of the ability to advance in these areas, but it's just the observation that, hey, it's slightly more difficult than it would have been like a year and a half ago type thing. Anyway, moving on, battles are taking place near Robotna and Verbova. The lines of contact are conditional. The situation in the area is very dynamic. And he says it's very difficult in many areas of the front. Probably one of the most difficult periods of the war is going on for the defense forces. So this is the acceptance that the Ukrainians are finding some really stiff resistance up and down the line, that the Russians are pushing in counterattacks in a number of places. Someone else says this confirms as well with what the ISW says. I have this feeling like Russia is walking into a trap. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, or it could be that Russia is just doing a good job of defending. But then, like I've talked about a lot recently, if Russia are doing such a good job of defending here, then they will be attriting their forces. We only need to go back and look at the losses on each day, where I start with what I start with in my opening news video, and think that actually the Russians, by doing this, will get to a point where they have exhausted, they've culminated in defense, which is kind of a bizarre thing. Normally you culminate when you have run out of momentum, you can't advance anymore in your attacking phase. If you're going on the offensive, you're using that momentum, continuing to go, but then at some point you just don't have the troops and the equipment to go, or the ammunition supplies to go any further. So it's not that you've been defeated, it's just that you run out and you stop and you regroup, and hopefully you get enough reinforcements and supplies to then at some point in the future carry on attacking. But Russia are effectively on the defensive here, but they are kind of counterattacking in defense, and they are exhausting themselves in doing so. This is me thinking, and you might think this is an overly optimistic view of what's going on, but I can't see it any other way. I mean, it is kind of optimistic for the Ukrainians, but I mean, this is what's happening. The Russians are pushing and pushing and pushing. We know that they don't have a depth of forces to draw on, in terms of they haven't done a general mobilization. There was talk yesterday about the need for them to do general mobilization because they just don't have the troops. And here they are defending, you can argue, pretty well in a number of places, and they're relying heavily on the earthworks that they've built, the trenches and the mines and the other obstacles. Yes, but they're also throwing in a lot of troops and a lot of equipment and losing those troops and equipment, so that they're going to culminate, and then that's when Ukraine go, right, are you done? Are we ready? Is that all? Have you got any more, Russia? No? Okay. And now we're attack. And at that point, Russia, because they've done such a good job of defending, now are unable to do a good job of defending. Do you know what I mean? So this is, yeah, you might think this is really good for Russia, and it's all, yeah, they are stopping the Ukrainians from advancing. Well done, but then at some point there could well be a tipping point where the Russians just don't have the ability to stop the Ukrainians breaking through lines in in multiple places. Let me know if you think that's overly optimistic. No report says regarding the Svatova Karmazianivka area. He says, I refer to a post he made yesterday, and actually I've shared that with you yesterday, which is that they are pushing the Russians back to their initial lines by Karmazianivka and Kozlivka, Raya Rodka, so on and so forth. But as I say, I did share that with you previously. So then we're going to go and look at what's going on in the Bakhmut area, Kurdyivka to Bakhmut. Russia counterattacked in the northern part of Klishchiivka, but were thrown back behind the railway tracks. There is preliminary info that Ukrainians have crossed the railway tracks. This would be interesting. North of Kurdyivka and is attacking its northern outskirts of Zelenopilia. So Kurdyivka is here. There is a smaller Zelenopilia settlement just there. And if you can see this railway line going up, which is essentially the front line here. If they've crossed the railway line here, it's a bit like a trench line, then you can just go up behind the railway line, both north and south, or move into Kodiamivka. It's a bit like a river or a trench line. You cross that in one place, and it allows you to have success, a more widespread success from there. So that could be really good news for the Ukrainians there. But then no reports is fairly positive for the Ukrainians. Is a fairly upbeat pro-Ukrainian source. We come to look at the southern front line, Vasilivka to Robotna. So that's not Staromyorsk. Not too much news from him on there, other than just footage being produced of hits there. Oh, we do have. Sorry, my bad. We do have some. I didn't see this. So okay, we'll go to Velika Novosilka first. Staromilsky sort of area. The Russian Vostok battalion confirms that the Ukrainians have entered Uruzhaini. So you can see now Uruzhaini, Staromilsky being taken here and consolidated. That the Ukrainians can attack across the river there from the west to the east. Uruzhaini is then being attacked from the north, from the west, and apparently also from the east. Later, Ukrainian sources added this is likely the northern part where the Ukrainians have grabbed a foothold. The Ukrainians keep pressuring west of Staromilsky towards Pryutny and Zavitny. So towards Pryutny there and down south to Zavitny. So Zavitny is the next one after Staromilsky down the river. So you can imagine they are pushing down south as well as trying to take what was this big sort of Russian salient, I guess, but Russians were on the defensive here. That was under Russian control on the high ground. That is being chipped away, and no report seems to indicate that the Russians are being pushed back all along this area. There was talk about Novodonetsky being liberated. No reports has that, and Novomayorsky pretty much in the grey zone, particularly Novodonetsky in the grey zone there. We'll see what other sources say later in the map update as to whether that is the case. And then here, finally, we'll come to what no report says about Kherson and Dnipro River a bit later, because that's pretty interesting. But the Vasilivka, which is there next to the reservoir, and the Robotna salient, which is just south of Orikhiv and Malotokmachka. So Ukrainians have expanded the area of certain control with a 5.5 square kilometer area, while deepening the grey zone southeast and east of Robotna, in Robotna itself and towards Verbove. So this is a claim that the Ukrainians are in Robotna. Preliminary info that the Ukrainians made gains near Kopani changed to a grey zone. So this is a settlement to the west of Robotna. So they are, according to no reports, making gains in the area. This is positive news coming from this front line, this sector. And then fighting is east and southeast of Robotna. So this is tough. There are huge amounts of minefields and Russian defenses, trenches around here. You can see the trench lines built into his map there, which gives you an idea. And they broke these initial trenches. You can see just there. And they are under Ukrainian control. And the idea is, can they move down the trenches towards Verbove? But they have a second line here, just south of Novopivka. And then we get towards Tokmak. This is a really dense area of Russian defenses, and is, as I've said before, I don't quite know why they're attacking here, down through this way, because it is the most difficult. Even but I don't know the terrain. There will be reasons, I'm sure, but even this way would have surely been slightly more sensible. But then I don't have the information they do, right? And then they are still active towards Luhove from Kamyanska, but no granular information about that. Surat maps. So I'll be flipping back and forth between places here. This is Klishchivka admitting that the Russians have been, they've been a stalwart advocate for Russia still holding Klishchivka, and indeed, this is what the map still shows for Surat maps, that the Russians are still in control of Klishchivka, whereas everyone else is saying they've been pushed back to this railway line. But they have admitted that the Russians have been pushed back a little to the north. Andrew Perpetua had this, like, what, 5 days ago? I'm pretty sure I was talking about this before I left for my holidays, and there's video evidence to suggest that. So Surat lines really are very slow at admitting Ukrainian gains and very quick at admitting Russian gains, and I think that is borne out there. So this is news about Uruzhany from Max23 saying it's very difficult there, but our heroes are doing a titanic job. Mines were very difficult to pass. So that might be hiding that the Ukrainians might have made many, they're making gains there. It's difficult, and that they are making losses, predominantly because of mines in the area, or it's just painfully slow. Because, as I said yesterday, they can only advance as fast as they can crawl, really, because many of these mines are getting cleared by hand by people literally crawling between trenches, clearing minefields. Because the larger vehicles that can do it more quickly, like a Miklik or something, is also exceptionally vulnerable, because they're basically the vanguard. And if you are just a mine clearing vehicle sent in in the first attack to clear the minefields, then hey, all the artillery and ATGMs are going to be firing at you. So they are just so vulnerable to being taken out. And the Zaporizhia front, says another source, this is Getty, I think referring to, I don't know, this is a Russian source, that actually in the Robotna-Verbove road section, the Russian forces have recaptured some lost positions there, a tiny bit of land, according to this source. Again, goes against all the sources we've seen before, but all the other sources have been very much pro-Ukrainian. Here, the Ukrainian armed forces, and this is kind of referring to deep state map, have achieved tactical success in the Malatok-Machka-Robotna area of Zaporizhia region and continue their counteroffensive in the Melitopol and Berdyansk directions. Hanamalia, so this is coming also from the Deputy Minister for Defense. According to Malia, the Ukrainian armed forces are gaining ground on new frontiers. So it's a positive outlook, and that supports what Null reports are saying. Right, we're now going to pop down to Kherson, where there's a few interesting claims coming out. Okay, if you remember the Antonivsky Bridge over the Dnipro River, just sort of northeast of Kherson city, that then goes into Oleshki. So Oleshki, heavy Ukrainian artillery is striking western Oleshki, facing the Ukrainian advance along the Konka River. So there's this other smaller river called the Konka River, where the Ukrainians are supposedly marching up. I suppose I should get my map out, really. Okay. So here is my map of the area. We have Andrew Perpetua, the blue line here, saying that Ukrainians are struggling to still, kick the Russians off this Antonivsky Bridge area and back to Oleshki. Other sources, like No Report, saying that the Russians aren't there and they've pulled back to Oleshki. Well, now we've got the claim that the Ukrainians are advancing eastwards along this sort of Konka River area. This kind of possibly a kind of island there, and that the western areas of Oleshki are getting hit by artillery. So just to continue here, so there was a report that Russia signaled some time ago that it might not reinforce Oleshki after all its assaults on the Ukrainian bridgehead had failed, resulting in large unsustainable Russian losses. Heavy Ukrainian artillery strikes in western Oleshki facing the Ukrainian advance along the Konka River. So that is fairly significant. What does that say? That there's this large concentration of artillery in this area there. I think, is that where we're talking about as that? Yeah, it goes through those large areas here. So that's where the Ukrainians are hitting at the moment with artillery, and they are possibly advancing to the west here. But it's not just that. So Null Reports then says, I waited to update on this subject, but now Russian channels are also started noticing for about 1 to 2 days, fighting is ongoing on the outskirts of Kazachi-Laheri, occupied left bank. Whether this is a Ukrainian deep reconnaissance group or a permanent push, we will see. And so he refers to something that Romanov said previously, another doom post from Romanov confirming the increased Ukrainian presence on the left bank, while also talking about Kazachi-Laheri, which is way more east of Oleshki. Quote, the situation is becoming very serious, said Romanov. So he has taken over from Evil Gherkin for being a kind of ultra-nationalist but realist, talking about this area up here, Kazachi-Laheri. So you can see there is, this is quite a way away from Oleshki, and it could be another kind of a third area where the Ukrainians have got some purchase on the other side of the bank, because we've also been hearing in the last few days that Holopristan down here to the southeast of Kherson, there's perhaps a Ukrainian bridgehead there too. So they've could have presence, a foothold on the occupied side on the left bank. So as the river flows, that's the direction. So left and right bank, or indeed we could say southern bank, or some people say west bank of the Dnipro here. So at Holopristan, at Oleshki, and at Kazachi-Laheri. So to continue with what he was saying there, so that was Romanov. He's then come out, no reports, just half an hour ago, and said Russian soldiers on the one hand say that the Ukrainians have managed to penetrate 800 meters deep into their defensive lines, which mainly consists of mobilized soldiers, while others say it was a small and unsuccessful attack. One of them is lying. So which of the Russians are lying? The Russians saying that the Ukrainians have succeeded in penetrating their lines. Why would they be saying that? What would be the rationale for them saying that, if it's a lie? Or the other claim is that they repelled an unsuccessful Ukrainian attack. Well, the rationale for them saying that would be to present this narrative that the Russians are not being defeated, that they are being successful everywhere, so on and so forth, the kind of Russian MOD line. So that's happening there. Interesting. I think this is going to be the place to look out for over the next week, I guess. Right, moving on to military aid. Really, really good news. If this is true, then it's significant, because I think Storm Shadows and now Scalp from France have been a game changer in the same way HIMARS were. I think those are the two game changers of this war. HIMARS and then Storm Shadow. And when I say HIMARS, don't forget the other multiple launch rocket systems that are not HIMARS, that are the tracked versions. Is it the N240? I don't know if that's correct for configuration of numbers and letters. But there are other ones that do the same kind of job as like the Mars 2, the German Mars 2, and the British variants. So they were a game changer, but also Storm Shadow. Storm Shadow have been so important. Anyway, Germany is ready to hand over Taurus long-range missiles. I was talking about this yesterday. A few days changes things. So Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine, said Yehor Chernev, the head of the permanent delegation of the Verkhovna Rada, that's the Ukrainian Parliament of Ukraine, to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. My friends, quote, my friends from the Bundestag have just informed me that the key parliamentary factions have reached a consensus on the transfer of long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Quote, for a long time we worked with the German parliamentarians to form a support group, and now finally the ice has broken, Chernev wrote. This is massively significant. These can fly a range of 500 kilometers at an altitude of 30 to 70 meters and have a 480 kilogram warhead. It depends on the range here as to what they're set for and whether they have the kind of the regulated range of like 300 kilometers so that they can export them and whatnot and keep in line with regulations on missiles. It seems weird to have these regulations in war, right? Or concerning war things, but they technically have a range of 500 kilometers, which would be pretty significant. And yeah, the Germans are arguably ready to send them. This is weird. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson said at a press conference that the country's authorities had decided to provide Ukraine with additional military assistance. The kingdom intends to transfer the Archer self-propelled guns to Kyiv for the first time. I thought they'd already been given these. I'd heard that they're on the front line already in certain places. I haven't seen footage. I thought I had, but it was actually Caesar that I showed to you. But there are claims that the archers are already there, so I don't really know what's going on here. But anyway, nonetheless, if they get archers, or maybe it's additional archers, that's brilliant. By the end of the year, Ukraine will produce NATO standard 155mm ammunition. This was announced by Minister for Strategic Industries Alexander Kamishin. So he's the guy that was in charge of the railways, who's a bit of a legend, has been doing an amazing job. He did such a good job with the railways during the outbreak of the war and onwards, and keeping them running, and just basically being a bit of a legend, that he was put in as Minister for Strategic Industries and has been amazing in that job. So he's upped Ukraine's production of pretty much everything, and is basically a superhuman. According, obviously, I'm over egging it, but you get the point. According to him, Ukraine's defense industry can serve as an engine for economic recovery and secure the country after the war, which is, I think, a good strategizing there. Well, actually, not only that, Ukraine currently produces 4 times more Stugna P. I gave you a thread explaining the Stugna P as this ATGM anti-tank guided missile system that is particularly successful, has been particularly successful over the course of the war. So they're now producing 4 times more anti-tank missile systems. So that's the whole system than at the beginning of the year, Minister of Strategic Industry. So that's not the beginning of the war. That's the beginning of the year. So that's, New Year's Day, 2022 into 23, and they've upped it times 4 since then. So that's really good. Said during a live TV interview in Ukraine. Stugna P is an Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile system with a range of 5.5 kilometers. It's interesting that that's now up to 5.5. It was kind of generally thought of as a 5-kilometer range, but we've seen a whole bunch of footage of them hitting stuff of up to 6 kilometers away. So that's really cool. Now this. Intrusive thoughts. Ukraine could start using DJI Agras T-40 UAVs, so these drones, to airdrop soldiers right into Russian lines. The drone can hold up to 115 pounds. A video from America where anything is possible. I don't know. I don't know if someone crawling through the undergrowth is going to more successfully get to the front line than someone that is a very easy target hanging from a huge drone that makes quite a lot of sound, no doubt. But it looks pretty cool and will no doubt have military applications. There was a similar one in the UK that has been seen. I think that is in Ukraine possibly, that can hold a stretcher beneath it, so that could be used for getting injured personnel out of precarious positions. And I thought this was pretty interesting footage. Launchers from Ukrainian NASAMS and the S-125. The S-125 is an old air defense surface-to-air missile air defense system that has been modified to fire, a bit like the S-300s, to fire ground-to-ground, surface-to-surface. And I don't know about how successful they are at hitting their targets. We had one in Taganrog, a Russian city that basically hit the center of the city. And I don't know if there was a military target there or whether that was just somewhat inaccurate. But that's the S-125. I thought it would be interesting to show that being fired. And the first batch of Abrams tanks that the US is providing to Ukraine has been approved for shipment over the weekend, and the tanks are on track to arrive in Ukraine by early autumn, said Army Acquisition Chief Doug Bush on Monday. So good news, that's all going ahead. They're training on them presently in Europe. I don't know if it's in Germany or in Poland, but the Ukrainians are training on a whole bunch of Abrams that have been sent to Europe, but they were sent there to be the training tanks and not to be the ones that were going to finally end up in Ukraine. So the ones that are going to be sent to Ukraine will be sent, I presume, soon from the US. Okay, geopolitical stuff. The AFP, Agence France Presse, Poland accuses Belarus Russia of orchestrating new migrant influx. So Belarus and Russia are orchestrating a new influx of migrants into the EU through the Polish border. Deputy Interior Minister for Poland told the AFP on August 7th, as cited by The Guardian, quote, "We're talking about an operation organized by the Russian and Belarusian secret services that is getting more and more intense," Vasik said. I don't know whether this is going to be some kind of anti-immigration line from the Polish, whether they're being opportunistic, perhaps, or whether this is a genuine threat. There was talk about Wagner getting through the lines there in the gap between Kaliningrad and Russia into Poland and causing all sorts of trouble. It's worth knowing that Italy accused Wagner of being behind some of the uh, asylum boats that have been crossing the Med, particularly to Italy. So Italy have a big problem with migration from North Africa, and we hear about these sort of boat people that has increasingly become a problem for European nations for the last over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Well, this is now there were claims, sorry, that Wagner were actually behind that because they know that if they can help with the EU immigration problem, then that will help to undermine the EU and the unity within the EU. So they're doing everything they can to to foment discord within the EU concerning migration. And then they'll, together with that, they'll have troll factories stoking people on the internet and on Twitter and places with kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and that stirs up a real hornet's nest. And then you get people like Meloni's right-wing coalition coming into Italy on the back of kind of activity like this, and you would think this is all going to Putin's plan, but then Meloni turned around and became a really staunch advocate for Ukraine in a move that was really unexpected amongst a lot of the political analysts. Anyway, I'm just kind of digressing, but here we have possibly a same approach from Belarus and Russia in trying to cause problems in Poland with immigration. And then, if a couple of those immigrants happen to be Wagner fighters that can then go and cause some sabotage within Poland, then you've got further problems. So watch out for that, I guess. Now, I didn't report this yesterday because I was like, don't know if it's got anything to do with the war. Actually, there are now claims that it has. So yesterday in Turkey, there was a grain storage area that exploded. Okay, and the GUR suggests that Russia, so Ukrainian intelligence is suggesting that Russia may be involved in the explosion in the port of Turkey. The situation is very strange. The explosion of the elevator in Turkey on the eve of a possible visit of Putin's dictator to Turkey, where the grain corridor is planned to be discussed. Uh, so I'm sure the Russians could claim that it's the Ukrainians, so on and so forth. But the initial claims were that it was, as this person says, my bet is on a dust explosion. That is likely if dry, fine material accumulates and is not cleaned regularly. One can see the buff before the flames. Should it be high explosives, there wouldn't be such behavior. In other words, I mean, you had to be really, really careful with these grain storage silos because grain dust can be really explosive. That's why, hitting a DESA, you can get some pretty big explosions when you hit grain storage. You think, well, it's not going to explode; it's just dry stuff, right? But actually, the dust is very explosive. It's why you weren't allowed to walk around places like these with hobnail boots with nails in the soles that could cause sparks. Same with like old wool. Um, uh, what are they called? Mills. These old mills and whatnot in north of England. You could cause really big fires and explosions. Just by having sparks where you might not expect them. So anyway, I yet again am digressing. So let's move on. President's office denies Ukraine has softened its position on peace talks. So again, this is something I almost reported on yesterday. So Wall Street Journal came out with an article. I think it was the Wall Street Journal. Ukraine's presidential office has denied reports that Kiev has softened its position regarding the withdrawal of Russian troops on as the condition to start peace talks. So there were claims, and these have been jumped on by appeasers, saying that here's time to do peace now because the Ukrainians are willing uh, to make some what's the word? Can't think of the word. I'd stop the video there. Compromises, that's my multiple sclerosis. Can't find words when I need them. The Wall Street Journal reported, citing unnamed European officials, that Ukraine didn't press the full withdrawal demand, the key point of its peace formula, at an August the 5th meeting in Saudi Arabia that gathered diplomats and national security advisors from dozens of countries. During a meeting in Kyiv with journalists on August the 7th, members of Ukraine's delegation denied reports saying that Ukraine hasn't changed its stance. So, not quite sure what's going on there, whether there's any truth in Ukraine sort of beginning to think about being able to compromise or do some peace deal uh, uh, sort of diplomacy, or whether this is pro-appeasers stirring the pot. I don't know. And the last sort of geopolitical thing to mention, we yesterday flagged a big rise in German exports to Kyrgyzstan, says Robin Brooks. The surge is broad-based with big rises for things like clothing, beverages, metalware, etc. But the biggest sales rise is in, not surprisingly, motor vehicles and parts. That's the blue stuff there. Russia's oligarchs like their German cars. So this is very interesting. What explains these exports from Germany to Kyrgyzstan suddenly exploding in sort of 2022? Oh my goodness, EU and US sanctions on Russia. So German companies are getting around that by exporting to Kyrgyzstan, and then Kyrgyzstan, whacking it all into Russia. Does this include parts that can be co-opted to use in weaponry? I don't know. Is this something the EU needs to look at and Germany needs to look at? Almost certainly could be a bit of a problem. And I'm sure this is not just Germany. I'm fairly sure there'll be every nation on earth that would otherwise be adhering to sanctions doing things like this. Companies are profit driven and not morality driven, sadly. They are answerable to their shareholders, who generally aren't so morally inclined, or at least it's not their primary objective. Right. Long live the free market and all that. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Sorry, this has been slightly longer. Lots of stuff to discuss. Anyway, I'll try to get to you a bit later today. It does depend on what's going on here. I need to go and see my family now. They probably think I've fallen into the sea and drowned or something. Take care. Speak soon. Doodle pits.